I still remember the sound my tires made when I pulled into the driveway that afternoon because it was the last normal sound I heard before everything in my retirement changed. I'd only been retired for about 3 months, finally settling into a slower pace after spending 37 years running commercial electrical jobs all over western Colorado. My wife used to joke that she had to schedule appointments just to see me. And after she passed, that little detached garage behind my house became the place where I kept myself busy, fixing old radios, restoring hand tools, building shelves nobody really needed. It wasn't fancy, just an old cedar-sided garage that had been standing there since the late 80s. But inside those walls lived more memories than I could ever explain. My father's heavy maple workbench still had burn marks from the first welding project we ruined together. My grandfather's collection of hand planes lined one wall exactly where he taught me to sharpen them when I was 12. Every dent in that concrete floor had a story attached to it. So when I rounded the corner and saw nothing but broken lumber, shattered concrete blocks, twisted roofing tin, and a cloud of pale gray dust drifting through the afternoon sunlight, my brain simply refused to process it. I actually stopped my truck in the middle of the driveway and sat there with both hands on the steering wheel thinking maybe I had pulled into the wrong neighborhood somehow. But there was my mailbox. There was my porch. There was my old oak tree. The only thing missing was 35 years of my life. The smell hit me next. Fresh concrete dust mixed with diesel exhaust from heavy equipment that had already finished the job. Workers were loading debris into dumpsters like they were cleaning up after a storm instead of erasing someone's history. I climbed out of the truck without even shutting the engine off. One of the workers glanced at me, then looked away. Another lowered his head like he didn't want eye contact. That's when I noticed a familiar man standing beside a white pickup wearing sunglasses and holding a clipboard like he was supervising a landscaping project instead of a demolition. His name was Brent Calloway, president of our homeowners association, the kind of guy who always smiled just a little too much when he was telling somebody they couldn't paint their mailbox or park a fishing boat in the driveway. We'd never had any real fights before. He'd sent the usual reminder letters over the years about weeds getting too tall or trash cans sitting outside too long, nothing worth remembering. I walked straight toward him, slowly enough that I surprised even myself. I wasn't yelling. I wasn't shaking. Somehow I was calm, almost too calm. I stopped a few feet away and asked the simplest question I could think of. "Brent, where's my garage?" He looked over the top of his sunglasses, gave a little shrug, then smiled in that polished HOA way I'd grown to recognize. "You had plenty of opportunities to prevent this, Nolan. The structure violated our updated architectural standards. Multiple notices were sent. You chose to ignore them." I just stared at him. "What notices?" He tapped the clipboard with one finger. "Certified mail, community emails, compliance deadlines. We followed procedure." I knew immediately he was lying, or at least telling the version of the truth that benefited him. I checked my mailbox every single day. I still paid every bill with paper checks, because old habits die hard. Nothing had ever arrived. No certified letters. No warning, no hearing, nothing. I looked past him at the empty space where my garage used to stand and noticed my father's workbench sticking halfway out of a dumpster, split clean down the middle by an excavator bucket. That hit harder than I expected. For just a second, I couldn't hear Brent anymore. His voice faded behind the ringing in my ears as memories came flooding back. Dad teaching me how to square a board. Grandpa laughing because I'd glued two pieces together backward. My wife bringing lemonade out during hot summer afternoons while pretending she wasn't secretly checking to make sure I hadn't forgotten dinner again. All of it buried under broken lumber because somebody wanted the neighborhood to look more modern. Brent finally asked, "Are we done here?" I looked him right in the eye and quietly answered, "Not even close." He chuckled like I'd made a harmless joke, climbed into his truck, and drove away without another word. I stood there until sunset, picking through the rubble with my own hands, rescuing whatever I could before the dumpsters disappeared. Near the back corner, I found a weathered metal box that had somehow survived. Inside were old property records, survey maps, warranty papers, and the thick folder we'd received at closing nearly 20 years earlier. I almost tossed it into the truck without looking, but one yellow document caught my eye. An easement agreement recorded decades before the HOA even existed. At first, I couldn't remember why it looked familiar, but something about a handwritten note in the margin made me stop. That little piece of paper would become the one thing Brent should have prayed I'd never read again. And by the time I finished going through every page that night, I realized they hadn't just destroyed my garage. They'd accidentally handed me every bit of leverage I would ever need. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still see that broken workbench sticking out of the dumpster, like somebody had ripped a chapter out of my family's history and tossed it away because it didn't match the neighborhood color palette. Around midnight, I spread every document across my dining room table, poured another cup of coffee that had long since stopped helping, and started reading line by line instead of skimming the way I had when we bought the place years earlier. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect: insurance forms, inspection reports, HOA bylaws, warranty information that expired before my truck was even paid off. Then I reached that faded easement agreement. It had been recorded nearly 15 years before the subdivision existed, back when this entire area had been ranch land divided into only a handful of parcels. The language wasn't glamorous, but it was clear. The property owner granted access across a portion of the driveway so future utility crews and authorized community traffic could reach what eventually became the neighborhood entrance. In return, that access had to remain in good condition, could not interfere with the owner's peaceful use of the property, and could never be expanded beyond its original recorded dimensions without written permission from the landowner. I read it once, then again, then a third time. My stomach tightened because I remembered something odd from years ago. During construction, the developer had widened the entrance to make room for decorative stone walls and landscaping. Nobody ever asked me for permission. Nobody ever amended the easement. Somehow everyone had simply assumed they owned the right to use whatever part of my driveway they pleased, because it had been there so long. The next morning, I called an old friend named Dennis, a retired county surveyor I'd worked with on several commercial projects years earlier. He laughed when I explained why I was calling. "You finally reading those closing papers?" he teased. "Only about 20 years late," I answered. By noon, Dennis was standing beside me with a drone, old survey markers, and equipment that looked far more expensive than anything a retired man should own. We spent almost 4 hours mapping every property corner, every recorded easement, every boundary pin buried beneath the gravel. When the final overlay appeared on his tablet, we both stood there without saying a word. Then Dennis slowly looked at me over his glasses. "Well, I'll be damned. The HOA's entrance didn't just touch my property. It depended on it. Nearly the entire paved access lane crossed my recorded driveway before entering community land. Without that strip, the association had no legal route connecting the public road to their amenities." I asked him the question already forming in my head. "You're sure?" He zoomed in until individual property lines became impossible to mistake. "I've been doing this 42 years. Nolan, I'd bet my pension on it." I thanked him, paid him for his time even though he protested, then drove straight into town without calling a lawyer, without calling the sheriff, without calling Brent. Some people expected me to file a lawsuit immediately, but lawsuits take months, sometimes years. I wasn't interested in speeches anymore. I wanted them to understand exactly what it felt like to wake up one morning and discover that somebody else had decided your property no longer belonged to you. I hired the same paving company that had resurfaced a church parking lot a few years earlier. The owner recognized me from an electrical project we'd completed together. "Need some repairs?" he asked. "Complete resurfacing," I replied. "Start tomorrow morning." He looked surprised. "That's not cheap." "I know. It cost me $32,000. Money I'd planned to spend traveling after retirement. But some investments aren't measured in dollars. They're measured in peace of mind." Before any concrete was poured, I met with an attorney named Melissa Grant, a woman whose reputation around the county was simple. She never exaggerated, and she never told clients what they wanted to hear. She studied the survey, compared it against the easement, then leaned back in her chair. You have every right to improve your own driveway, she said, as long as you're not intentionally violating the recorded easement. What if the improvements happen to prevent unauthorized use beyond the easement? I asked. She smiled for the first time. That's a very different question. We spent another hour discussing measurements, setback requirements, and exactly where my property rights began and ended. I wasn't looking for revenge anymore. I was looking for precision. If Brent wanted to hide behind paperwork, then paperwork would become the only language either of us spoke. The paving crew arrived before sunrise 2 days later. They milled away sections of cracked asphalt, reinforced the base, and poured a beautiful new surface that honestly looked better than anything I'd ever owned. Neighbors slowed their cars to watch, assuming I was simply repairing the damage left by the demolition. Nobody realized something else was happening near the edge of the easement, exactly where Melissa had marked the legal boundary. The crew installed 3 reinforced concrete safety barriers designed to protect private property from unauthorized vehicle traffic during construction projects. They weren't decorative. They weren't temporary plastic barricades. Each one weighed several thousand pounds and sat entirely on my side of the legal line while leaving every inch of the recorded easement itself intact. The only thing they prevented was the HOA's decades-long habit of driving several feet outside the area they actually possessed the right to use. By the time the crew packed up, the association's oversized entrance lane had effectively narrowed back to its original legal dimensions, a width too small for two-way traffic through the decorative stone walls. Brent's board had proudly installed years earlier. I slept better that night than I had since my garage disappeared. At 6:30 the next morning, my phone started ringing. I ignored it. At 6:45, somebody pounded on my front door hard enough to rattle the windows. Through the peephole, I saw Brent, the property manager, and 2 board members wearing expressions that looked somewhere between panic and disbelief. I opened the door holding a coffee mug. Brent skipped every polite greeting. "What the hell did you do?" I took a sip before answering. "Morning to you two." He pointed toward the driveway. "Remove those barriers immediately." "Why?" I asked. "Because you've blocked the community entrance." I couldn't help smiling. "Just a little." "No, Brent. I repaired my driveway." His face turned bright red. "People can't get through." "Really? That's strange. I drove through just fine." He knew exactly what I meant. So did everyone standing behind him. The problem wasn't that access had disappeared. The problem was that the HOA had quietly relied on land they never legally controlled for years. And now that convenience was gone. "You're doing this out of spite," one board member snapped. "No," I answered calmly. "I'm doing this because someone demolished my garage without giving me the courtesy of knocking on my front door first." Brent stepped closer until we were only a few feet apart. "You'll regret this." I looked past him toward the entrance where residents had already started gathering, watching the traffic back up onto the county road while confused delivery drivers tried to figure out why the neighborhood suddenly couldn't function. "You know what I regretted?" I said quietly. "Finding my father's workbench in a dumpster." Nobody spoke after that. They simply turned around and walked away. Over the next several hours, the neighborhood transformed into complete chaos. Landscaping trucks couldn't enter. Pool maintenance was canceled. Delivery vans turned around. Parents complained because school buses struggled to maneuver through the narrowed lane. Residents flooded the HOA office demanding answers while Brent desperately tried explaining a legal situation he himself had created. By lunchtime, local police stopped by after receiving multiple traffic complaints. One officer inspected the survey stakes, reviewed the documents Melissa had prepared, and finally shrugged. "Looks like he's on his own property," he told Brent. "This is a civil matter." Watching Brent hear those 4 words was strangely satisfying because they were almost identical to what his board had told countless homeowners over the years. Whenever somebody complained about unfair treatment, suddenly the rules they loved enforcing were no longer working in their favor. And for the first time since that excavator crushed my garage, I realized the balance of power had quietly shifted. The board could threaten me all they wanted, but this time, the law wasn't standing behind them. It was standing beside me. By the third day, the entire neighborhood had stopped arguing about landscaping rules and mailbox colors because everyone was talking about one thing: the entrance. Every conversation at the grocery store, every post in the community Facebook group, every gathering outside the mail kiosk somehow circled back to the same question. How could the HOA have built an entire system around property they didn't actually control? I didn't have to answer that question, because people were finally asking it themselves. Late that Thursday afternoon, my attorney called and said, "They're ready to talk." I drove to the association clubhouse, ironically entering through the same bottleneck they had spent years pretending belonged to them. Brent was already sitting at the conference table with the property manager, 2 board members, their attorney, and expressions that looked very different from the confidence I'd seen the day my garage disappeared. Nobody smiled this time. Their attorney cleared his throat first. "Mr. Walker, we'd like to resolve this matter without further litigation." I leaned back in my chair. "That's funny. I would have liked to resolve the demolition before it happened." The room fell silent. Brent shifted uncomfortably but still couldn't bring himself to apologize. His attorney slid a folder across the table. Inside was a settlement proposal. They would compensate me for the value of the garage. I closed the folder without reading another page. "You didn't destroy a shed," I said quietly. "You destroyed 35 years of memories, family heirlooms, custom tools, and a building you never had the legal authority to touch. Money alone doesn't fix that." For the first time since this entire nightmare started, Brent finally looked directly at me. "What do you want?" It wasn't anger in his voice anymore. It was exhaustion. I answered without hesitation because I'd already decided days earlier. "I want a written admission that the demolition was unauthorized. I want a formal apology signed by every board member who approved it. I want my garage rebuilt at your expense using materials equal to or better than what stood there before. I want compensation for everything inside that was destroyed. And when all of that is finished, I'll remove the barriers." Nobody spoke for nearly a full minute. Eventually, their attorney nodded. "Those terms are reasonable considering the circumstances." Brent looked like he'd swallowed broken glass, but he also knew he had run out of options. Residents were furious. Vendors were threatening breach of contract claims. Emergency access plans were already being reviewed by the county. Every additional day cost the association far more than simply admitting they had been wrong. 4 days later, we signed the final agreement. The HOA paid me $45,000 in damages, hired a licensed contractor to rebuild my detached garage from the ground up, replaced equipment they could document, and delivered a formal letter acknowledging that the demolition had occurred without proper legal authority or verified notice. I framed that apology instead of hanging it over anybody's head, not because I wanted to embarrass them, but because I wanted a reminder that even ordinary people can protect themselves when they refuse to be bullied. About 2 weeks later, I watched construction crews pour a brand new foundation where the old garage had once stood. A young carpenter asked me where I wanted the new workbench positioned. I smiled and told him exactly where the old one was. Some things deserve to stay where they belong. Brent never spoke much after that. He finished out his term on the board. But neighbors looked at him differently. Not because I humiliated him. He managed that himself. Power has a strange way of convincing people they're untouchable until they discover one document, one forgotten agreement, one ordinary homeowner willing to read the fine print. As for me, retirement eventually became peaceful again. The smell of fresh-cut lumber returned to my backyard. New tools slowly filled the cabinets. Friends stopped by more often than they ever had before, sometimes to help build shelves, sometimes just to drink coffee and laugh about how life can turn upside down in a single afternoon. Every now and then, someone asks if I think I went too far by narrowing that entrance and forcing the HOA into a corner. I always give the same answer. I never blocked what they legally owned. I simply stopped allowing them to use what they never did. There's a difference, and that difference matters. If someone had knocked on my door, shown me real paperwork, treated me with even a little respect, this entire story would never have happened. Instead, they chose arrogance over conversation, assumptions over facts, and authority over basic decency. In the end, it wasn't revenge that won. It was patience, documentation, and understanding the rights attached to a piece of land everyone else had forgotten. So now I'm genuinely curious what you think. If you came home and found part of your family's history reduced to rubble because an HOA claimed it knew better than you, would you have handled it different, or would you have done exactly what I did? Let me know in the comments, because these situations are rarely as black and white as people think. And if you enjoy stories about real property disputes, neighborhood conflicts, and ordinary homeowners standing up for themselves through patience instead of intimidation, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with someone who's ever had to deal with an HOA that forgot who it was supposed to serve.